It's clear that your work has just been so beautiful and such a significant contribution to kind of spreading critical consciousness about the impact of historical trauma from colonization on the mental health of Indigenous people, and as well as the therapeutic interventions that you've helped develop that honor Indigenous healing practices. And so thank you for that contribution and work. For the purposes of this interview, because we are focusing on qualitative methodology, the first question that we had is coming from this observation from one of your talks, that there was a point in your career doing Indigenous psychological research where you realize it's not just about the content, which is, you know, what we know, but also the method, how we go about knowing. And so with that framing, would you be able to give a brief description of Indigenous inquiry and how you started to realize that in your career as an academic researcher?
Well, sure. Thanks for having me. This is really enjoyable to have a chance to unpack some of these issues with you and to reflect on my career in some important respects. And when it comes to Indigenous psychology, of course, there's a whole precedent for just thinking about Indigenous psychology as the exploration of psychological concepts, ideas, and experiences, you know, from peoples around the world, many of whom happen to be Indigenous, but the indigeneity in that instance refers to local, people, what used to be called folk psychology, perhaps. But when I talk about Indigenous psychology, I'm really talking about the psychology of Indigenous peoples. And I think it comes down to some different domains that refers to. One has to do with what I've been inspired by since graduate school is a kind of interpretive cultural psychology. This is the cultural psychology that's not the old cross-cultural psychology that then adopted that term, where you have big international samples where you compare, you know, Eastern and Western cognition across undergraduate populations at those universities. The interpretive cultural psychology I'm advocating is kind of the Rick Schwader style, in which one's trying to understand the diversity in mind and mentality. And that really does have more diverse methodological precedents that has an anthropological component. And perhaps that's why I find myself in the Department of Anthropology today, even though I'm not trained formally as an anthropologist. So that Indigenous cultural psychology is one domain. And then, of course, there's ways in which one can undertake explorations of specific aspects of an Indigenous set of experiences in a community. I think about the medical anthropologist Teresa O'Neill, one of my former mentors, actually, who studied loneliness among the Salish Flathead people of Montana as a way of talking about clinical depression. So there's those kinds of examples. Then there's the sort of application of Indigenous concepts and ideas of psychology, mind, mentality for purposes of programs and services. I've done quite a bit of that. In some ways, that's the most important thing that I see myself as doing. And then, of course, there's this novel contribution to knowledge that comes from Indigenous ways of knowing. And in some ways, that's what people often get excited about recently, too, in terms of what are the alternative epistemological foundations for making sense of the world and how we harness that for purposes of academic inquiry. And so I think it's the last two probably that you're most interested in here. Obviously, my main hook in all of this, trained as a clinical community psychologist, is really therapeutic practice. And so a good deal of what my career has been about is trying to unpack and explore the traditional precedents for American Indian therapeutic expertise, and then to juxtapose those, compare, contrast those with the kinds of things we learn in professional psychology, counseling, psychotherapy, those sorts of things, to get a better handle on the ways in which those traditional approaches in our communities, diverge in some really fundamental ways from, psychotherapy and counseling, which is, of course, a very modern form of help. And I think there are lots of ways in which it diverges, some ways in which it overlaps, depends on the order of abstraction in which you're interested. But in many respects, when I think about even like decolonizing psychology, professional psychology, or an anti-colonial approach maybe to professional psychology, the key domain for me is thinking about how do we help people, since, as you know, our communities suffer often from disparities in mental health status.
I think the applied aspect of your research is really what you were just focusing on and emphasizing, is the like doing research for the application of therapeutic programs and interventions. And One thing that you had mentioned in one of your previous talks is this period in your career where you thought indigenous inquiry was kind of maybe doing more like participatory action research using Western research methodologies, but then it shifted. There's actually a shift in understanding epistemology and methods and how we go about knowing. So do you mind sharing a little bit of that shift in your own mind as a researcher when you started to really understand what indigenous inquiry is in particular?
Yeah, well, the practical problem solving side of this issue of how do we offer helping services in indigenous communities that are relevant for everyone, not just those who are pretty acculturated to modern life, has been the driving force. In doing so, I've harnessed traditional ways of knowing, for those purposes. I'm not sure I think of myself as someone who's had some big shift. And I'm not sure that I think of myself as someone who boxes methodological approaches in, the usual opposition, Western indigenous. So in that respect, I'm sorry to resist your framing there, but it's sort of not how I think about it, in part because I think for my approach, the practical problem solving is the issue, and I'm open to whatever tools will help us. And I think that those tools, in terms of methodological tools for making knowledge, can be drawn pretty liberally. For me, the fundamental commitment of indigenous psychology in the way we've been talking is an ethical commitment. It is about the participatory engagement that helps to remedy and repair the long history of exploitative research or research that just was not relevant or did not take account of indigenous voices to the degree it needed to. And so I do think that qualitative inquiry in particular serves a really important set of anti-colonial functions. On the one hand, it contextualizes our experiences in coloniality or colonization, which is really important. It can center the cultural commitments that every indigenous community I've spent time in advances in all kinds of important ways. It privileges insider or emic perspectives on matters psychological and therapeutic, and it preserves voice. I mean, there's just not enough indigenous voices in modern research, but I don't think that means that the qualitative methods that we're all familiar with in SQIP and throughout those of us who've tracked and invested in the promotion of these methods are necessarily at odds with that just because they happen to be invented by a non-indigenous person in a non-indigenous setting. So in that sense, I'm actually much more practical and pragmatic about these things. And I think the challenge of comparing and contrasting the indigenous quote with the Western quote is that it can end up essentializing. And I really think that the essentializing is a problem. And so I just try not to do it. I'm not against people wanting to recover, reclaim, harness, and apply what are often described as indigenous epistemologies or aspects of indigenous ontology and axiology and all the rest. But I do think that the opposition is not as important as working towards some benefit in partnership with indigenous people, because I think it can be just as anti-colonial for a partnership to decide that the way forward involves, totally or only using so-called Western methods, if that's what the partnership wants. I mean, so to me, the difference between something that's anti-colonial and neo-colonial might not be obvious from a casual look. It might only be a function of what partners have chosen to do together. It has to do with self-determination, agentic expression, and so on. So on the one hand, I think qualitative inquiry in particular has ways to be specifically harnessed for anti-colonial work in psychology. And I think that when indigenous scholars write about indigenous scholarship and academic knowledge production, they tend to underscore the importance of qualitative inquiry. They often talk about how our experiences and our way of conveying knowledge is narratively conveyed or storied in very important ways. Certainly if you're committed to cultural reclamation and revitalization, understandings of cultural practice and cultural orientation, cultural experience, work best with the way, in many respects, if you want thick descriptions that really try to get at what the logics and understandings are, that looks a lot like social or cultural anthropology in terms of ethnography, at least. So, I don't know if ethnography is an indigenous method. I think you could make a good argument that it's not. And yet I think it's very, very useful for anti-colonial work in partnership with indigenous people for advancing indigenous psychology.
One thing I noted is just You use both the terms anti-colonial and decolonial in what you were saying there. And I'm curious if you would share a little bit more about how you differentiate those terms, since decolonial is a little bit more of a common term.
The terms decolonial and anti-colonial do have slightly different implications, and I typically prefer anti-colonial to decolonial unless there's opportunity to really clarify what decolonial means. So I have an article coming out in the Journal of Counseling Psychology probably this month that is all about decolonization in counseling psychology, or by extension professional psychology, where I have a chance to develop some of these ideas a bit. The issue with decolonization is that we have some indigenous critiques of the way that word gets applied. So you might be familiar with Eve Tuck, who wrote an article with a co-author Yang, all about decolonization is not a metaphor. And the argument of this article is that decolonization is applied in general for emancipatory projects and work throughout various endeavors. And their concern is that in doing so, we distract or take away attention from what decolonization must mean, they say, in indigenous communities, which is return of lands and a restoration of indigenous relationships to lands. So it's land focused. And of course, the colonization in the United States, settler colonialism, involved dispossession. That was fundamentally the thing that drove it, was access to land. And so, with colonialism, settler colonialism involves dispossession of lands. Decoloniality entails the restoration of those lands, and anything else risks distracting and also muddying the waters. I mean, there's plenty of good emancipatory projects by lots of other constituencies that entail those constituencies getting their piece of the American pie that further advances potentially settler colonialism. So, the idea that we can all breezily link arms and move forward in decolonial fashion without recognizing that actually people's oppressions are intertwined in ways that some people's emancipatory efforts might actually further other people's oppression without them even knowing it, is what's at stake, I think, in this critique of the decolonial metaphor. And so because of that, I try to use now only the term decolonization with respect to land stuff. I think that's one way we can move forward. So anti-colonial will be much broader. If we're talking about methodologies, if we're talking about knowledge production, if we're talking about curricula in graduate school, for all that sort of thing, I think we need to be careful in using that term decolonizing.
Maybe following from that, just in kind of the next question was more about maybe talking about a specific research example that highlights the work you're doing in this area, particularly, in partnership with Indigenous communities, and maybe speaking to a little bit, if you consider that project to be part of something you would call Indigenous inquiry, and using Indigenous ways of knowing.
One would be the Blackfeet Culture Camp. The Blackfeet Culture Camp was an endeavor in which I approached the addiction treatment program in the Blackfeet Nation, which is on a reservation in northwestern Montana. And I happen to have been acquainted with the director of the program at that time, Patrick Kath-Looking. Pat and I co-authored articles about this. And my invitation to Pat at that time was, look, addiction treatment, as you're administering it, is based on the 12 steps, 12 traditions of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's a kind of Hazelton treatment model. It's a residential. People come for 30, 60, 90, 120 days at a time. They're behind locked doors at night. They go to structured groups all day. And you do have a cultural counselor. You have a little bit of Blackfeet stuff for people who want it. But it's really founded on 12 steps, 12 traditions of AA. What would it look like, I asked, if we were to think about addiction treatment that first and foremost privileged Blackfeet therapeutic tradition? How would a program take shape that centered that? And, Pat got very excited about this. He put me together with Danny Edwards, who was his cultural counselor at that time. And we started working on, first just blueprinting. Well, what could this look like? Well, Danny was linked with a group of grassroots neo-traditionalists on the Blackfeet Reservation, the Blackfeet Crazy Dog Society. And so he wanted us to involve them in developing what this would look like. And so we consulted with them. In fact, I remember we went to one of their ceremonies and we were in the lodge with them for a couple hours before it was our turn to present what we wanted to do. And finally it was our turn. I looked to Danny to present our project, and Danny said, well, Joe, take it away. So the ceremonial leader was asking what we wanted. And I went ahead and explained, well, we're here to talk about soliciting your help for developing a different kind of treatment approach for addiction. because, this one privileges AA, and maybe there's a different way to do it. And we also want to try to figure out a way to evaluate it because, science doesn't really know that cultural tradition, ceremonial practice of this sort can remedy addiction. And before I could finish that sentence, the lodge erupted in laughter. I mean, for 10 seconds, there was hysterical guffaws because in the end, the ceremonial leader said, every single person sitting in this lodge is proof that participation in ceremony and cultural practices remedies addiction. So it was just completely nonsensical that scientists don't know that these things can matter. Because of Danny and his effort and Pat's support, the Crazy Dog Society mapped out a Blackfeet culture camp. This was a summer cultural immersion camp designed to help addiction clients who were interested live more like their ancestors did prior to the reservation era. The first thing we did in this camp was to put up teepees and have a pipe ceremony. And then the next day we went out into the brush and built a sweat lodge and had a sweat lodge ceremony. And throughout there was harvesting, sacred or medicinal plants. There was going to visit sacred sites, just lots of activities. The important thing about this was it was first and foremost developed by the Blackfeet Crazy Dogs, not by people with addiction treatment expertise. It was outdoors. It had all of the things that they felt were important. And fundamentally at its foundation, it was ceremonial and religious, which actually, I would defy you to find any indigenous therapeutic tradition that's not religious or spiritual. And so right there, you see a big distinction. That's in part, though, why AA probably takes hold more so than other kinds of approaches to treatment for addiction in Indian country, is because it too has a spiritual component. In some of the other settings I've been in, people involved in addiction treatment in indigenous communities just really have no interest in approaches that are not spiritual or religious. And so, this was an example then of a whole approach to treatment being developed in partnership that was oriented toward trying to recenter the approach to treatment on indigenous ways of knowing. And it yielded an approach that was replicated summers in a row by my partners there, who were so impressed and thought it so important that they were channeling some of their own resources to sort of make it happen. More and more clients got interested and involved and so on. Now, it was sort of pilot in organization when I was first involved. So there wasn't an opportunity to really strenuously evaluate it. One can question whether it's evaluatable in the usual ways. And in the article I wrote with Pat, we reflect on that. So, about how hard it would be. So if you're interested more in the evaluation issues, there's more to say about that. But here's an example then of trying to harness indigenous ways of knowing as they intersect with therapeutic expertise. And the overarching commitment is that health, well-being, thriving, prosperity, all comes from a proper relationship with spirit beings that require ceremonial and sacred approaches. And that's totally different than the work we do in psychology, the things we're trained to do in psychology. And yet I think that's for people who are oriented more traditionally. It's not everyone in Indian country, although I would say that the best epidemiological evidence we have for tribal nations is that the vast majority of people in these communities are religious or do believe in spiritual things, whether it's Christian, whether it's traditional, whether it's both. So I think that's just one example of the way one can harness ways of knowing. Now, is that methodological exactly? Well, it's methodological in the sense that, one would even go there and one would work with people to try to figure this out. But I think that for folks who aren't really all that immersed in indigenous knowledge production, they could see this as participatory action research, or there's lots of ways to understand it that doesn't look so different, and the framing of it and the work that went into that sort of thing is not so different. So, and I think that's true even for indigenous scholars who advance indigenous ways of knowing through what has been termed indigenous research methodologies. A lot of what they're interested in is really about the packaging, the ethics, the commitments of a pro-indigenous ethos, if you will. Never mind that, there's been traditions of narrative analysis as qualitative inquiry for generations now in academia that may look very much like what indigenous scholars do with stories. So I think there is a political project that wants to have recognition for indigenous knowledge, indigenous expertise, indigenous authority, and that's very important. Whether or not one has to know or accept that for purposes of recognizing methods that can be useful for advancing indigenous well-being, I'm not sure.
I want to follow up a little bit about the spiritual aspect of what you're talking about. How do we account for that in this Western academic system when that arises? And so I know you had spoken to the spiritual aspects in terms of ways of knowing for treatment, right? Mental health treatment. Is that also present in inquiry, in the research process? And if so, when that emerges, how do you integrate that with these other ways of knowing? Yeah.
Sure, sure. When it comes to research in indigenous communities here in the United States or Canada, places like that, doing so is a very delicate, sensitive matter. And this has to do with the history of colonial subjugation of our peoples, in which, the operating dynamic was civilization versus savagery. And so indigenous peoples were deemed savage. Our ways of life were deemed inferior. And the assumption was we were either going to go extinct or maybe, luckily, by some stroke of goodwill on behalf of settler and colonial society, be integrated and endure only as integrated melting pot style citizens. And so because of this form of subjugation, I remember my grandma, for example, telling me how, the Catholic missionaries on our reservation in the late 1800s, put so much pressure because they had so much authority from the state to influence our lives, that they pressured medicine people to, throw their bundles into the ground and bury them, for example, as a deliberate and visible effort to show conversion to a more civilized form of religious practice, Christianity, supposedly, right? So, this history means that we're very aware that the spiritual and religious traditions and practices that we maintain, have escaped against all odds in many instances, the kind of extinction that comes with colonial subjugation. And so when it comes to writing and talking about these experiences, it is sensitive. We, as peoples, are deeply aware of the fact that there are, New Age enthusiasts throughout America who are very excited to appropriate, really misappropriate our traditions and experiences for all kinds of reasons. It's a huge market, so it's market driven in some ways. And it's deeply offensive then for the idea that outsiders will come and take what they want and not have any relationship or accountability to us. So what that means is part of the pro-Indigenous ethos I'm talking about, that is the frame for anti-colonial research in our communities, has to respect and take stock of this history and recognize that there are lots of things that are just not to be shared. Now, which of those things are to be shared or not is something that requires a partnership, because it's up to your partners about that sort of thing. And that's why the participatory collaborative approach that community psychologists take is so important. I have done presentations and, of course, in my work, unpack or write about Indigenous traditional healing. Indigenous traditional healing has those same sacred ceremonial facets. One way that I have undertaken this work to be careful not to reproduce misappropriation and divulging of things that should not be divulged is I look back to things that are already published or already written for purposes of analysis. Now that can be hazardous too, because a lot of what's written may not be accurate, or there's, again, so much New Age enthusiasm that who knows, you really have to have a better sense for the source and what it has to say. You might be familiar, for example, with Black Elk Speaks, a really famous work from the 1930s in which a Lakota holy man named Black Elk talked to a white poet, John Neihardt. And John Neihart's goal was to write an epic poem about America based on a big signature vision that Black Elk had. And this ended up being Black Elk Speaks. But the problem with consulting Black Elk Speaks is it's more Neihardt than Black Elk. I mean, he selectively edited or altered things in ways that, accounted for his vision. So this is an example of, it's widely known. People look to it and harness it in different ways, maybe without being entirely clear that Neihardt, took liberties. One thing that I've drawn on in my work has been the writings of my own great-grandfather, Frederick P. Gone. Fred Gone worked at our reservation in 1941 to 1942 as a reservation field worker for the Montana Writers Project. This was a WPA funded endeavor in the state of Montana to try to, get written up folk knowledge from around the state, not just Indians, but, white settlers as well, or settler descendants. But there were some people on reservations, and my great grandfather was the field worker for our people, the Aani Grovant. And so during that time, he wrote some 700 pages of longhand script about culture, traditions, history, that sort of thing. And his signature work, I'd say, was a life history of our most famous 19th century medicine man named Bull Lodge. And there's all kinds of detail in here about his healing activities and how he became a doctor, the visions he had, and the experiences of a sacred or religious nature that gave rise to his expertise and authority and accomplishment. And so that's an example where my great grandfather wrote that specifically to preserve that knowledge for future generations of Grovant people, but other people too. And so because of the family connection and because of his motivation for writing it, and because the government paid for it, it's in the public domain, no one owns it. This is an example of how I can access material, healing vignettes and so on for purposes of analysis that isn't going to run afoul of some of the concerns that are contemporary and so on. I should say isn't going to, actually it still can, but at least there's a justification or rationale for why it's different than if you were to write up something that people felt very secretive or sensitive about today.
That tension you're speaking of, and again, not to, I think it's so difficult, but the way academic knowledge is done to not fall into kind of essentializing or a binary or something like that, where you're attempting to, you're working with these communities and trying to see what is the type of practice, what is the type of knowledge production or practice that is really going to be of the most benefit here. And you're employed in an academic institution, and you're navigating it there and seeing kind of like what you can bring there as well, but then potentially also getting pushback there. And so I think that was one of the other topics, that Nisha and I were talking about in terms of, navigating kind of that tension where you might be getting pushback, certainly within, academia, in terms of like incorporating indigenous epistemologies or different types of approaches. But it sounds like also there's maybe not necessarily pushback, but there's just so many considerations you have in trying to like harness some of those resources from academia in working with indigenous communities as well, and making sure it doesn't end up being harmful.
Well, that's right. And I think the best advice I ever got career-wise was from one of my mentors. I was really fortunate to have, at least 4 mentors throughout my graduate school years. And I loved graduate school in Illinois. It's one of the best experiences of my life. And my primary mentor was a community psychologist named Julian Rappaport. And I remember Julian really encouraging me to be true to my intellectual interest and my vision, and to go press forward in pursuit of what I had in mind, irrespective of what other people might have thought about it. And as a consequence, when I got my first academic job at the University of Chicago, that process of just trying to get a job was really illuminating, because I think I was not as aware of how conservative psychology as a discipline was at that time. My first job was not in psychology. It was an interdisciplinary social science appointment in the Committee on Human Development at the University of Chicago, which was just I loved that job. And it was an opportunity to be with sociologists and the anthropologists and psychologists and even biologists who were talking together and working on projects that had overlapping interests. In some sense, it's the last bastion, still is the last bastion of the big interdisciplinary social science projects that happened for a long time in the 20th century, including here at Harvard. There was social relations, which doesn't exist now, but in which a lot of those faculty colleagues there got their training in. So in some ways, I am an interdisciplinary social scientist of that variety. That's why I'm trained as a psychologist. I got tenured in a psychology department, but now I'm in an anthropology department and in a medical school. I mean, it's that interdisciplinary stuff, I think, that matters. So I wasn't as aware of how, disciplinary psychology could be, which of course is why they're called disciplines. When I joined the University of Michigan after just 2 years at Chicago, my spouse and I got jobs there, which solved our commuter marriage problem. In the Department of Psychology, I learned all that discipline and had to make choices. I think it was my first year there, I was encouraged by our chair to pull a mentoring committee together of senior colleagues for advice. So I pulled people who I knew would be supportive from our department, and did, like a 40-minute presentation. Here are the questions I'm interested in. Here are the studies I want to do. Here are the kind of findings I might get. Here's what I want to publish and where I might publish it. And when I was done, there was some silence. And then one of these very senior colleagues said to me, well, that's all well and good, but if you want to get tenure in this department, you should save all that for later. And I didn't doubt for a second, this person had my interests at heart. This person was trying to be helpful. But what she said was, original data collection is too slow, community partnerships are too messy, and you have to publish or perish in a very limited amount of time. So why don't you just go do African-American data, which we have already existing in huge databases, and study that. So I had this decision point of the very kind that my advisor had talked to me about, which was, how much do I pursue my own distinctive vision that I care about and I've been preparing for, and how much do I set all that aside for later? And in talking with my advisor about it, he said, well, if you have to set it all aside, what was the purpose of all that preparation? And if you're going to go ahead and move forward anyway, and they don't tenure you, why would you want to be tenured in a department that doesn't value or respect what you do? So these were helpful illuminating. And so I decided, with minor modifications, like trying to attend to things, like you have to have a constituency when you're on the tenure track, who in the end is going to value what you do and have something to say. So, you have to attend to some of these things, but I decided to stick with my own vision. And as a consequence, when my tenure portfolio went out, I had to send, I think, a dozen of my articles, or 10 of my, no, it was probably like 8 to 10. I can't remember exactly, which was a subset. So I had more than that. But of that subset that sent out for tenure review, there was not statistics in any of them. I wouldn't be surprised if that's unprecedented in that department, or in most psychology departments at that time, certainly of that kind of caliber or rank. And I did not know if I was going to get tenure in that department till the fall of the year I was under review, because I had no idea what folks would say in response. And when I got, a summary of the reports and so on after that summer, I knew it was okay. But the whole time I was on the tenure track, I thought there was a good chance I'd be leaving. So that has a kind of psychological impact and a kind of set of consequences about even how you think you belong or don't belong, whether you establish deep roots, things like that. So I think there were, I also think that there were, let me finish that sentence. There were risks associated with undertaking work of this kind in certain locations. And in my case, I think because it was work on a very underrepresented, appreciated population, to a set of problems that have broad resonance in professional psychology, in multicultural psychology, and indigenous studies. I was jointly appointed in Native American indigenous studies as well there. So, I think there were opportunities to compensate for what might be seen as weaknesses around the methodological or some of those other aspects, that worked out. But that's the trick, is how do you thread a needle if you're going to do stuff that's really off the beaten path? And you have to have constituencies. You have to be aware that, the commitment I made to myself in that original decision was, I have to be prolific enough that if I don't get tenure, it's not because I didn't publish enough. And it has to be work I'm proud of myself, because I don't want to get tenure for work I'm not proud of. Why would I want to do that? So that was my commitment to myself. And I feel like I realized that, and it worked out. I think I could have realized that, and it might not have worked out as well. So there are these risks in this life. I think psychology is different now. I think the emergence of SQIP as a society is just huge. A kind of a seismic shift, because it's a culmination of the senior people who are involved in founding and establishing SQIP. I have so much admiration for them. It was such an honor just to be among them as looking at what they were doing. And I came in at the point that they had already sort of established it, so I wasn't really there from the beginning. My interest was in trying to make SQIP a home for people with more diverse social identities and commitments to other kinds of research. And that's sort of hard, I found out, just because methodology itself isn't always where people are really thinking in those, where they're interested in the kinds of things I'm talking about, pragmatic things. How do we improve lives? And there's a way in which, thinking about the method side of it is, can feel maybe a little distracting to some people, but I've always really appreciated it because I have some philosophical interests about science and so on that have made it also interesting. So
I want to follow up with that question, the philosophical interest in science. But I also want to remark on your integrity that I hear you saying throughout your career, that and the support that you've been provided by mentors and colleagues on staying true to your ethical commitments. I think that's really helpful for all of us to hear, right? Is I mean, sometimes I think that we can think we are in opposition to the academy as well sometimes, but throughout your talk, what I hear you saying is there are a lot of people supporting this kind of work and supporting the ethics and the integrity in our field, even if we have to search for them.
Very much so. I do think that the entire arc of my career is um, I'm completely dependent on mentorship and support and guidance. I mentioned Julian Rappaport already as my primary mentor, but I also got really significant mentoring from another mentor, Peggy J. Miller, who was in psychology and speech communication at Illinois. Peggy mentored me on narrative analysis. My very first article was a narrative analysis that was very deconstructive, if you will, about how you represent a narrative and how you unpack it. So doing qualitative inquiry during those early or decades before my career, where it was really marginalized, I think, at that time, but doing it anyway. And of course, she was tenured and all of that. So she was a beacon for how to do this sort of thing. And I mentioned Teresa O'Neill, a psychiatric anthropologist who could mentor me in this sort of things. But then going on at Chicago, Rick Schwader became a mentor and has advocated for me in really important ways. And now I'm even still, having arrived at Harvard just 3 years ago, I'm really honored to be guided and mentored by people like Byron Good, Arthur Kleinman. So I think that these things depend an awful lot. I think about, in multicultural psychology, Gordie Hall, now at Oregon, was there at very significant times. Rob Sellers at Michigan. There's just, I could go on and on and on. There's lots and lots and lots of people who made my career possible. And that's the thing, is that you do this work and so on, and the integrity, and that's all good, but there's kind of an individualist cast to that that's just not also accurate. It does depend on other people being willing to say, this is great, you should support this person. And so, you have to figure out how to find that as well, I think.
So then the question coming from you thinking a lot about the philosophy of science and I think about it because there has been so much that qualitative researchers have had to fight for the empiricism of our work and stuff. And so I do wonder about your understanding of science and how to situate or talk about maybe more indigenous methods of inquiry within the context of science.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Obviously, science commands such authority in our society, maybe a little less in recent years, but it still has great power to command resources, to command attention, to drive policy, et cetera. And it's not that there aren't other things that do that too, but science just has probably more authority than in some cases it deserves. So I think in the work that we do, qualitative inquiry, whether it's indigenous or not, we want it to be recognized and legitimated as science. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be. There are narrow views of what's scientific, and in psychology departments, you can run into that, certainly. But the fact is that science is not one thing. It never has been one thing. It's debatable over what even basic criteria you could generate that would define science that would apply to astronomy or to paleontology or psychology. It's just very diverse. And Paul Feyerabend observed, for example, that really there is no method that you could distill science down to that would apply to all that we think of as science. And in fact, I think his was advocating for the fact that you're against method, that we actually should be quite profligate in the kind of inquiry we do. Now, of course, that's not necessarily social science. And anyway, the point is that there's a lot of thinking before us that has led psychology to shift away from, that kind of logical positivism of the 30s, which very quickly, I think, was no longer sustainable. But I think a lot of psychologists do psychological science in a way that we might call naive positivism, as one of my former graduate students, Dennis Wendt, once called it. Naive positivism is not really a commitment to positivism, because if you ask people, they'll say, oh, yeah, I don't mean that. But it's business as usual, as if it were positivist in many respects. And I think, nowadays, we recognize that, particularly even in phases of scientific work, there's more exploratory open-ended work, and then there could be theoretical testing later, and, those sorts of things, that there's a range of activities, depending on where a field is at, that one can adopt. And so qualitative inquiry has a place in that, or also there's different forms of inquiry that, in terms of what your goal is in terms of understanding. So yeah, there's this long tradition in psychology of testing theories. But there's also a long tradition from its very beginning in trying to get at, the kind of human science aspect of what it means to be a person who is self-interpreting, and for whom cultural orientations and patterns shape one's life. And so, there are these multiple traditions that we've heard about more and more, I think, in our field, that allow for greater diversity in the work that we do. So we don't want to give up the label of science, but I think it's fair to differentiate some of the different aspects of science. Indigenous people also talk about their own sciences. Often because of the political agenda, it's opposed with Western science. I try really hard not to use Western and Indigenous in opposition. I mean, I think, because actually I think Indigenous peoples in America are Western. It's not that we're entirely or only, but we go to school, we have literacy, we believe in rights and law, and all these things that I don't know how you say that that's not Western. So I don't think those are helpful. Those high order level abstractions and oppositions are essentializing in ways that overlook all kinds of nuance. So I try to stay away from them. I can sometimes contrast traditional and professional, maybe, or traditional and modern sometimes, although I'm sure those have their challenges too. But I'm just trying to pick a language that avoids some of the essentialist logic that's useful politically sometimes. So this is the challenge. I mean, you can essentialize for political purposes, and maybe you just mean it rhetorically because you're trying to get something accomplished when it comes to power. And of course, I think we need more power, and we need to find ways to be emancipatory. I just wonder if we can't also do that and be precise in our language. So that's kind of where I come from. I guess if we think about Enlightenment science, I think what Indigenous people had as science before was not that. This looks pretty different. Enlightenment science draws on rationality and empiricism and harnesses skepticism within the assumption of kind of mechanistic materialism. Well, I think Indian science is not about mechanistic materialism. I mean, I think we have believed traditionally for a long time that all kinds of people inhabit our cosmos that are not human, and that those people exercise power and influence in ways that shape reality, or that make reality in ways that do not distill down to mechanistic materialism. So there are big distinctions between what we might think of as Enlightenment science and Indigenous science. And science itself is this abstraction, as you can see, as you try to trouble it or work it through. It's not one thing either. So, I think that maybe this is a lesson from social anthropology, which, some social anthropologists have grown suspicious of the term culture, because culture has been used as a noun for so very long that it too essentializes, as if there are groups of people that are alike within group, but different between groups, and bounded and stable over time. And this is not true. So even a term like culture is almost too much of an abstraction. It trades in essentialism if we're not really careful and qualified. So I try not to use culture as a noun, for example. And maybe the same thing should be said for science. But in any case, I think that we have an interest in marking qualitative inquiry of various sorts as scientific. I think that there's a case and a justification and a rationale for why these are scientific for a bunch of reasons. And I think we should just proceed with advocating for our inquiry in ways that make clear to our colleagues and naysayers and skeptics that these are important contributions to knowledge you would not get any other way. And how can you say that's not scientific?
And I think, kind of going with what you were just saying about navigating some of this complexity, just the last question was, are there any last pieces of advice you might have for graduate students, early career researchers who are wanting to engage with Indigenous methodologies and Indigenous ways of knowing, who are in the academic world? What are some of the things you might distill about what you'd want to say to those folks?
Yeah, well, it is very exciting because in some ways, indigenous ways of knowing, indigenous research methodologies are just taking shape in ways that are starting to become more noticeable throughout the scholarly world. It's not been in psychology so much. In fact, I just wrote a whole um, reference quality manuscript about about research with indigenous communities that's going to appear in the APA Handbook of Research Methodologies, in which I find that indigenous research methodologies or indigenous approaches to research just are not really in psychology much. There's a few here and there, but they're not. So I think it's exciting and opportune to learn more about those and to think about the ways in which they might apply in psychology research and psychological inquiry more generally. I think, keep in mind that there's the political project and there are also the kind of nuanced ways of thinking and talking. So be aware, at least if you're going to use those oppositions to, maybe talk about or acknowledge that they're rhetorical and they're designed for political purposes, but that if it comes down to it, you can also engage in a way that's more nuanced around what is distinctive and what's not. But I think that taking stock of these is really great. So I've drawn a lot on the work of a Canadian Mohawk scholar named Marlene Brandt Castellano, who talked in a chapter that I found very illuminating about indigenous traditions of knowledge. She basically says that indigenous traditional knowledge has come from three sources. There's traditional teachings that are handed down over time. There's, empirical knowledge that comes from interacting and observing the world for its patterns. And there's revealed knowledge, which, sacred, religious knowledge of beings telling you things, dreams and visions and so on. And she goes on to talk about, the ways in which indigenous ways of knowing are characterized by, 5 criteria. And I've reworked these just a bit so I could have a mnemonic to use. The mnemonic is HOPES, HOPES. And, she basically says that indigenous ways of knowing are holistic, oral, personal, experiential, and storied. And I think this is a good place to start in terms of thinking about what this might mean and how it intersects with academic knowledge production. Certainly in psychology, knowledge can be very abstract and experience distant as opposed to experience near, and authorized through expertise and credentialing, and legitimated through publication and literacy. All these things are like interesting tensions. So if you take indigenous ways of knowing as having some of these attributes, and it's not just Marlene Brandt Castellano who's put this forward. I think if you look at, people like Sean Wilson and Maggie Kovach and others who are championing indigenous research methodologies, Sweeney Winchief, you get many of these same kinds of ideas. So the question is, how do we bridge these different traditions? Is it possible? I think one way to think about it is the opposition earlier by Walter Ong between orality and literacy. The problem with that early tradition, it was as too totalizing, as if there are people who have literacy that changes their cognition and they're fundamentally different than those who practice primary orality. So it has to be updated, which I've tried to do in one of my articles. But orality and literacy, I think, are modes of knowing and interacting and engaging and understanding. And I think it's useful to think about the ways those intersect. I think, if I were to try to summarize what I think people advancing indigenous research methodologies are up to, is really trying to take seriously a kind of primary orality and figure out what that might look like in academic knowledge production. And it's fascinating because it's so ripe for exploring and explicating what that might mean, because there are tensions and things that don't seem like they would fit together. The main thing is, literacy, according to Ong, is really about an analytic modality, which means dissecting, taking apart, disaggregating, deconstructing, if you will. Whereas the oral modality, he would say, is agglomerative. It's about putting things together. It's the holism that people talk about in indigenous circles. So if you're into putting things together as opposed to taking things apart, how do you reconcile that exactly? And yet I think there's value in both of them. So if I were to posit the potential contributions of indigenous ways of knowing for psychology or other fields of scholarship, it's about, a science of interrelatedness, a science of how things fit together, come together and cohere, rather than a science of taking things apart to get at their basic fundamental constituents, And I think there's real interest and promise there, because if we think about human experience, we don't experience life in disaggregated, dissected fashion. It's an experience. And we're capable, of course, of analyzing that, but we're also capable of telling big stories that pull things together in ways that probably are not accurate in all kinds of ways to the things that we've experienced. So I just think it's really exciting to think about where that can take us. And if we can refine our language and get clear on what the contribution would be, and figure out how to harness those ideas and approaches for new knowledge, I just think it's going to be very, very wonderful.